Hey there, it's Chris Hogg, and we are live at Inventures, and I am super excited to be sitting down with Leah Sarich, the head of story at Thin Air Labs. Leah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is so fun.
I feel like we need to start out with like an on-screen visual of that Spider-Man meme pointing back and forth, because we live in different parts of the country, but we have experienced the media side, the storytelling side. And I love the fact, and I think I said this to you when we first met, I've never met anyone who has a title head of story.
Yeah.
It's not content leader or director or manager, but head of story. So I'd love to just kick off. You live inside Thin Air Labs. You run a podcast. What does a head of story do?
All the things. No.
All the things.
I was really deliberate about that title. I came up with that title with my colleague at the time, Jim Gibson, and we were really intentional about that because I wanted to be clear as a former journalist that didn't mean that I understood like marketing, for example, or other business concepts, because I didn't. And Thin Air Labs was my first transition out of traditional media into business. And that's a very common trajectory, as you know, for many journalists. Once they get out of the craziness of traditional media, they go into communications positions. And so we were toying with this notion of communications and director of communications and head of communications. But for me, what really brought me into the innovation space were the stories of the founders. And for me, it was about the stories. That's what it was. It wasn't about things like I've talked to you many times about this, about product market fit and revenue models and all that kind of stuff. It was about the stories of these founders. And so what I realized I wanted to do, and they were cool with it, was be the head of story.
So, you know, Alberta is an exploding ecosystem from a tech space. And we're obviously going to agree on probably most things today around the importance of story. But as you've watched this ecosystem grow, especially with your lens inside Thin Air Labs, like why do you think story is so important for companies that are growing?
Well, it's essential. People need to know that you exist. And I'm not talking about just your clients or customers. I'm talking about the world at large, your sector, your ecosystem. People need to know that you're around. But not only do they need to know that you're around, they need to know, what do you care about? What do you value? What's important to you? What makes you unique? What makes you special? Well, what's your why, right? And so the best way to communicate that is through a story, in my opinion. And especially in Calgary right now, like when I first entered the sector 5 years ago now, there wasn't a lot of storytelling going on. What I observed in my early days was that the people in the sector were really good at talking to each other, but not so much outside of their sector. And what I really wanted to do, it was an ambitious goal, was to get the tech sector to a point where people at dinner parties were talking about the tech sector in the same way that they talked about the oil and gas or energy business. So I think we're almost there. And I think we're really at an inflection point in Calgary where we can position ourselves as a leader in technology, and not just, tech the way we think of it in terms of like enterprise tech, but in all of the technological sectors. For life sciences is really exciting. Film and television and fintech and all the things. We can position ourselves as leaders in those spaces. But we've got to tell the stories. We got to make sure that everybody knows that Calgary is an evolving narrative. Alberta is an evolving narrative. And that evolution has to do with the tech sector.
So your approach with storytelling, the podcast that you run, being born, was it born inside Thin Air Labs, or did you bring it to Thin Air Labs?
No,
What's the origin story?
It's the origin, in Thin Air Labs. I came up with it there as something that we wanted to do as an organization.
And so how do you convince, maybe talk a little bit for those who don't know Thin Air Labs. We've got an audience that will span well outside Alberta. What is Thin Air Labs, and how did you convince the organization that this was so important?
That's a very good question. So Thin Air Labs is a venture capital firm, and we're a venture capital firm that lives to support the growth of founders. And we happen to do that in a few different ways. So we do it with our first fund, for example. We have a venture fund, and we have supported 22 companies via that fund. But we also support them with professional services. So we help them get non-dilutive funding through our Funding Catalyst program. We help them with software and product development and engineering with our product traction service. But we also support them with storytelling. And that is an effort to raise awareness and interest and investment in the founders that are here in Alberta. That's where it started.
And was it a tough arm to twist? So
originally we were talking about a podcast because, the CEO wanted to host the podcast. The founder wanted to host the podcast. And we were like, okay, that's cool. Like that happens. But then I was thinking to myself, but there's also me. And this is my training. This is my background. I did work as a broadcast journalist for over 20 years. Maybe I should host it. But I really struggled with that internally because I was thinking to myself, well, I don't know anything about business models and revenue generation and product market fit and things like that. I do now. But at the time, it was sort of like that wasn't my wheelhouse. But nor was it something that I was essentially curious about from the outset. Mm-hmm. And so I knew and I felt very deeply that if I was going to make a podcast that was successful, it had to be authentic, it had to be genuine, and I had to be personally deeply curious about it. Mm-hmm. And for me, what I'm essentially curious about are the founders that we work with. And the subtitle of the podcast is, why would you do this? Because that's really what I feel. Why would they do this? Being an entrepreneur and a founder is so hard. It's so risky. They have to work, all the hours. But the impact is so massive, and the vision that they have for a future that we can't see is so exciting. And so I just thought, these are great stories to tell. I want to tell these stories, and I want to help these founders share what they're doing.
I like the approach, and I've certainly, again, where this is the segment of agreement. I love the curiosity. I've talked to Tyler Chisholm about this with his new book that's focused on it. It's an inherent trait for me. It is for you also. Mm-hmm. And, there's a time and place to understand business models and financing and product market fit, but curiosity also pulls out different questions and different angles.
Absolutely.
As you've sat down with leaders and as you've grown to know the space and the innovation space, what advice do you have for other storytellers? Like, how do you use curiosity to put the pieces together for yourself?
Curiosity is essential. The best journalists are essentially curious. But I would also suggest the best entrepreneurs are also very, very curious. Because what do they do all day? They solve problems. Yep. They put out fires. Well, the ones that are doing that in a really creative and unique and interesting way are generally very, very curious. They're curious. They want to figure out, what is the problem here? What is really going on, and how can we solve it? That's inherently a curiosity venture, right? So I think that leaders, as they learn to get more comfortable with not just providing solutions, but getting deeply curious about the problem they're trying to solve, they will probably inevitably be a little bit more successful.
Another thing that becomes a bit of an advantage for those who sit in a seat that's interviewer is osmosis. Again, I'll throw an analogy that Tyler gave recently, that you get like hundreds of mini MBAs on a lot of different things.
Yep.
Do you, as you've watched Calgary in particular grow and mature, are there patterns you've seen in those stories you've heard?
Yeah, I do think that Calgarians in general like to solve really big problems. And I think that comes from sort of this background we have, first maybe in agriculture and then in oil and gas. Like, the problems they were solving in oil and gas are huge. These are ginormous problems. So there's this sort of level of comfort with tackling something really, really big. And I think that's a little bit unique to Calgary. And what I also love is that in Calgary, there is this notion of collaboration that is, I think, unique to the sector in Calgary and Alberta.
Real collaboration, too, not tokenism.
Precisely my point. That if someone wants to connect you with somebody, they actually will. Mm-hmm. They won't say, oh, yeah, we should have a meeting, and then it never happens. Yeah. Like, they will actually connect you to somebody who will actually help you. And what that's about is, in Alberta, it's not, nobody really cares where you went to school or who your family is or what's going on. They just care about what you're building and how hard you work. And if you do that with intention and authenticity. And I think that's really special in Calgary. And I think that's allowing us to grow a lot faster. And we're seeing that now.
In all the stories you've told, do any recent ones stand out on the way someone told it or the things that they're solving? I know this is kind of like pick your favorite kid.
Totally.
But, or maybe just what is a story that stands out to you? How do you get your attention as a storyteller?
Well, if you're authentic with me, then, generally everybody is. I think I really like pulling that out of people. Mm-hmm. But the stories that I remember the most are the ones when people get really emotional in the chair. And I think we do that because I've sort of created this safe space for us to have a conversation. I, as you know, do not have a video component to the podcast, and that's by design. That is to create an intimate space where we can have an authentic and genuine conversation. And maybe it's because I've been, interviewing people for years and years and years, but I think it's important to listen and ask the right questions at the right time in the conversation. And then you get these incredible, beautiful answers. And those are the ones that I love. When you get someone who's like this big, tough CEO guy of like an oil and gas company, and then 2 minutes later, he's like getting really emotional about how he treated his staff during the pandemic. And I love that. That's so awesome. Or you get another founder who told me the story of how she was pregnant with her child, and she had this whole plan set out to hand everything off. But guess what? Her baby came a month early, and she was taking calls from the NICU in the hospital to investors while she was dealing with her first child who was in the neonatal intensive care unit. So those are the stories that are so dramatic and so intense. But what they all come back to is how these founders do this work. It's so hard, and they are so focused on creating that impact in the world. And that's why I want to share that story, because they're just working so hard to create this solution, to solve this problem, and to have this impact. And I think I'm so privileged and honored to share those stories to help them do that.
Shocker, I agree. And the human moments, bringing out the human moments in conversation when you get a chance to connect is pretty powerful.
It really is.
It's adrenaline that can keep you running for a while too.
For sure.
I'm curious, and like from a macro standpoint, you're talking about building trust and alignment.
Absolutely.
And a lot of founders need to think about doing that to scale their businesses. When you've chatted with founders, or maybe you've got an approach when you're pulling a story out, like how should a founder think about building trust or alignment using stories with their audience?
Well, a lot of it has to do with that trust, right? And how you have to let people get to know you. And, a lot of entrepreneurs don't value that. They don't have time for it often. But I do think that's why when we ask someone, do you want to be on the podcast? I've never had a no. Everybody says yes. And so because they want to share their story, they want people to know who they are. And I think it's important for entrepreneurs to, take a moment, let their guard down, and share the story of why are they building this company? Where did this inspiration to do this work come from? Why do you think your solution is the one that people need to be paying attention to? Why should we buy your product or your platform or your service? It's an opportunity to share that story. And when you're sharing that story authentically, you're not just trying to sell me something. When you help me understand your why your solution you think is the best one, then I think you've got a much better chance of building trust and getting the clients that you want.
You're touching on gaps right now, and I wanted to, from a macro standpoint, this is an ecosystem that is changing rapidly. If we talk today and then talk again a year from now, it's probably different conversations. And a lot of it's been, we hear stories like Calgary needs to tell its own story better. And these are not my words, but the ecosystem echoes that. What kind of gaps do you see in the way stories have been told, or what we collectively need to do? Is there a focus or an industry or a way of going about things? Like the openness you're talking about is absolutely critical, but where are the gaps right now that you see?
I just think there needs to be more time and effort placed on storytelling. And, we've talked about this collaboration piece before where entrepreneurs are collaborating with each other. I think storytellers can do the same thing. I think there's so many of us starting to tell great stories. And I think we need to collaborate more and share each other's stories and help each other with our storytelling efforts. And then I think when a person sits down in the podcast studio, then you have to share that story. Make sure people are listening to it. And I think that partnerships are also incredibly helpful. Partnerships allow you to amplify and to get in front of new audiences. And I think I would love to see more and more sponsorships and podcast partnerships happen so that even more people are getting more eyeballs and more listens on the content they're creating.
Sponsorship is a tough thing. Like in the world of media, the business model is largely broken. It depends on how big you are, but anyone that isn't a behemoth, it's really tough to compete. It's tough to scale. It's tough to grow. Those moments where you wake up wondering whether you're doing things well. But the collaboration point I think is really important. And are you hearing like the companies that are sponsors or companies in the ecosystem that aren't and maybe should be with the podcast? Do they get it? Like, do they get the need to help fund the storytelling?
I think they're starting to. I think they're starting to. And I actually think venture capital has a place to play here. I think venture capital firms could really lean into this. And I would like to think of Thin Air Labs as a leader in this space where we've decided to really value storytelling and hire someone to do it and place value on that and support it. So I think venture capital firms could do that for their companies in their portfolio, or they could support someone else doing that kind of work.
It's not something I've seen widespread. Certainly Thin Air Labs, I would agree, is an exception to the rule, maybe. There's been lots of support from investors. We've certainly been supported along the way as we've grown. But I'm also wondering from an investor mindset, whether it's a sponsor or an actual VC, the whole how do we know it's working question and how do we measure it? How do you measure the success of what you're doing?
It's so hard to measure.
It is.
It really is. And podcasts particularly are really hard to measure because the technology just actually isn't there yet, from what I understand. I work with an incredible production company out of Edmonton called Astronomic Audio. So they handle all of the digital marketing for us and help me understand that. And it is really hard because it's not just about the downloads because, people can download it, but you don't even know if they're listening to it once they've downloaded it. So tracking listens, of course you can do that. And of course we want to see growth. But we also are tracking things like, we are hearing from other founders that they've listened to our podcast. And then other founders are saying, have you been on Leah's podcast? And an investor will be like, I heard one of the founders on your podcast. I want to know more about them. I want to meet them. I want to talk to them. That's incredible. So there's that word of mouth that happens. Again, hard to measure, but we're getting a lot of that validation from the people that we want to be in front of, right? It always why are you creating this podcast in the first case? Well, we wanted to increase an awareness and interest in the founders that we support and in the ecosystem itself, and then with policymakers. And so that's happening. We're getting that feedback. So that's great. So that for us is success. And we just want to keep growing that.
I always find it interesting when you can't reduce something to a number always.
That's right.
Because one really high quality number means more than 100 numbers that mean nothing.
Exactly.
And I find it interesting that some folks might try and distill it down to that and then in the same breath say, I heard the podcast, to your point.
Right.
There's where value is. And I think one of the things that we've seen, I'd love your thoughts on there's a bit of a maturity education standpoint. It's not to say that we would collectively know everything, but I think helping an audience understand how to measure this, like if that word of mouth spreads because you heard something, that's value creation.
Yes.
And there needs to be on us as storytellers it's on us to help educate the people who are helping fund us what they should be paying attention to as success metrics. Do you agree with that?
I do 100% agree with that. I've even had to do that internally because, they're like, well, how do we know this is working? I was like, okay, well, we can look at some of the data and the data is really helpful.
Yep.
But to your point, that doesn't tell the whole story. So one, I asked for patience. I was like, can we just try this? And instead of doing a giant outlay of money right out of the gate, we tested it. We tested the market first, right? So we just started with 6 episodes and put it out there and got some feedback and got some validation that, yes, we want these stories told. Do more of it. That sounds great. We loved hearing these stories. And we also love the way that you've designed the podcast. It's really unique in the space. People aren't doing that. And so when we get that validation, then we're just like, okay, we are onto something. So let's do another little chunk. So then we do 12 episodes. Okay, that's really working. Great. Now let's do 18 episodes and then let's do 24. So we're growing incrementally. And I think that makes the higher ups that make some of those financial decisions a little more comfortable. We're biting off a little bit at a time. And they can appreciate that notion of validation, right? Oh, okay, test the market, get some feedback, validate, and try it again. They get that. Entrepreneurs get that. And so that's what we're doing with the podcast.
We've been fortunate enough to sit here with corporate innovators and entrepreneurs, government folks, a big swath of people. And one thing we always ask is sort of what's next for you? Because in the world of tech, there's always a next thing that's coming.
Of course.
But what about in the world of story? What's next for you?
More. So, I have ambitious goals of growing this podcast exponentially. And I want to see spin-outs of it too. Just in the way that your favorite show, you see spin-offs and characters. I would love to see spin-offs of this podcast. And I think there's such an opportunity here for us to tell more stories. And maybe some of those podcasts have different branding and different focuses. Life sciences is such an exciting opportunity in Alberta specifically. I would love to see a whole podcast dedicated just to life science stories. But you could do that with any sector, fintech stories and life science stories, or you could do it with certain kinds of founders and what they're building. And the bottom line is just more. I want to scale it. I want to see more people listening. I want to see more people sharing. I want to see more people putting up their hands saying, I want to be on this podcast. I want to see policymakers and government supporting the storytelling and understanding the value of it in terms of evolving the narrative for this province and evolving the narrative, frankly, for Canada and positioning Canada as a leader in innovation. Canada has an opportunity to really leverage its brand of being a trusted country in tech, and we can do that in tech, right? So I think we have an opportunity there.
If folks want to get in touch with you to talk about those next steps, what's the best way to reach you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. It's easy.
LinkedIn's the best platform.
Yeah.
Great. Leah, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure entirely. Thanks for having me.
It was great. For more information on what Thin Air Labs is doing, what Leah's doing with her podcast, definitely check it out. And there's more info also on digitaljournal.com. Thanks for watching.